Well, after looking at the situation in Mythic Plus yesterday, today, right at the edge of the beginning of the second reset, we are looking at the situation in the raid. How have specs been performing in the raid? Which are the best performer, the worst performer, who has been surprising and has been a revelation in this first week? The difference between the results in Heroic versus the ones from Mythic. So that's what we are going to be taking a look at for today when it comes to raiding. Delaying to a few days from now the interesting question that's been going on in the Mythic Race to World First, where we are finding ourselves right now with a dozen and more guilds all stuck progressing on Tindral. It's a pretty cool situation that we don't see that often when it comes to top level progression. But let's go back talking about mortals, talking about more average players and their results in the raid so far. Now, don't get surprised if we look at the current results and you find, wow, marksmanship is at the top, and then there is subtlety, and then there is survival in the top 6. Not really. If you look at the amount of parses, the amount of logs, you will find only 6 marksmanship hunters, only 18 survival, and only 31 subtlety rogues. So these results are not even remotely as reliable. You would have to go and look, as we will, boss by boss for the results. We can instead go and take a look at the Mythic versus the Heroic results, because the first thing we looked at a few days ago were the initial results in Heroic when it came to the raid. Now we also have the initial results of Mythic from the raid. So this is our Mythic versus Heroic results so far. We can find some similarities between the upgrade of the harder difficulty. We can still see, for example, specs like Beast Mastery and Havoc being the 2 top specs, regardless of the difficulty. Same can be said towards the bottom. We still find specs like Subtlety, specs like Assassination, specs like Destruction, even Elemental, Frost Decay. We still see them much lower down. Even more, specs like Marksmanship and Survival don't even show up in the Mythic results because there are too few of them to be considered for this ranking. We do have some specs getting promoted a tiny bit more, like Demonology Warlock, for example, also Assassination Rogue in Mythic, and perhaps some of the surprises at the very least if we were to listen to, and for example, if we were to believe something like the simulations, right? Right before the release of this raid, we were also looking at something like this. So we were looking at, for example, supposed top performances of specs like Elemental, specs like, as we mentioned, Subtlety, but also specs like Feral Druid, as well as Survival. Now, when we go to the actual results of Mythic, you can find that, for example, Feral is all the way towards the bottom. In fact, at 164, they are the overall lowest out of all of the DPS, including losing to Augmentation Evoker, the many times nerfed Augmentation Evoker. Not quite the same, but still not as good, for example, for Elemental, another spec pinned to be a very good and well-performing spec in single target, for example, also doing quite poorly, just as poorly as specs you already knew were going to do badly, like Windwalker, Shadow, and Affliction. Here is your Shadow, your Windwalker, and your Affliction. That is definitely one of the more surprising results when it comes to the performances. Even if we're going to look at the tier list according to sub-creation, we still have these specs lingering towards the bottom. You have Survival, you have Windwalker, you have Subtlety, you also have Affliction, Marksmanship, Destruction, as well as Shadow Priest. So this is in terms of the rankings, abstract rankings given by the performance. If we actually look at the rankings themselves, boss by boss, this is the result for Gnarlroot. Now, of course, Gnarlroot has a very large component of AoE damage, right? With all of these small adds, which is roughly irrelevant. You can go and check, for example, at the boss damage of Gnarlroot to see a clearer picture in terms of damage results. This is even more surprising because boss damage supposedly should be your performance in single target, so you should be expecting to see specs like Outlaw, but more importantly, specs like Elemental Shaman doing super well. And then we go and look at the single target, of Nullroot, and we see Balance and Elemental Shaman at the very, very bottom. So that is why, not always, but in general, you shouldn't just blindly believe the results of sims for what you will get to actually see in reality when the raid is released. After that, you have Igira. The AoE damage of Igira is a bit more relevant because getting rid of the spears early on is still a valuable part of the mechanics of the boss. You can find specs we have, of course, seen before at the top, like Demo, like Beast Mastery, Havoc, Outlaw, and Assassination. This is more according to predictions, besides the two Marksmanship Hunters showing up at the top for some reason. After Igira, you have a pure single target fight in Volkoros. We can find specs like Assassination and Subtlety in pure single target doing very well, together with Beast Mastery, Enhancement, Survival. Again, the few handful of survival players doing well, as well as Havoc, Outlaw, and Feral. Now, these results are, of course, still early on. They are still very, very preliminary, even just looking at the logs of Volkoros. As you can see, there are basically more than half of the specs without even 100 logs available. So it's still prone to getting multiple sets of changes in terms of results. Not to mention, it's not that all of these specs are currently performing with their 4-piece set bonus. Many specs do. At this point, many players have gotten in the first week, especially raiders who are progressing on these level of mythic bosses, will have gotten a good amount of 4-piece set bonuses, but not all of them. Definitely, most of them at this point will have the 2-piece set bonus, but not the majority of them will have the 4-piece set bonus, especially if they did not do something like splits to be able to get more tier pieces. But these are the preliminary results as far as Mythic goes in the first reset. So at the end of this first week, when it comes to the DPS results, many of these were expected, right? We were expecting BM, as well as Demo, as well as Havoc, but also Assassination and Outlaw, together with a few other good performers like Enhancement, like Ret and Fury, with a question mark about Arms and Fury and which of them would have been ended up on top. And then same goes for the bad performers, specs like Destro, Affliction, specs like Windwalker, like Frost DK. Those were also reasonably expected to not be doing too well. So in terms of predictions, most of the results are following suit of what we expected. We mentioned a few of them being surprising, like for example Feral, like Elemental, also Subtlety, the poor guy suffering from these two specs being more considered, even though, as you can see, their DPS is at the bottom, despite actually deserving to be somewhere around this level. Unfortunately, for this tier, they are pretty unlucky. We have, though, not talked about the other side of raiding in terms of results, which is, of course, the healing, the HPS in general from the healing specs. Now, before the tier, our expectation for healing, the expected results for the HPS, for example, based on the tier sets, based on the changes to certain specs, were that Discipline as well as Mistweaver would have been the overall stronger sets of healers in the raid. And then the weakest ones would have been Holy Paladin and Holy Priest. Now, so far, the situation is more or less keeping up with the predictions, although it looks more closer than we expected. If we look at, for example, the HPS results right in the first week, we do see Discipline and Mistweaver being quite high, but also Resto Shaman and Evoker are keeping up with Discipline in terms of healing, and Mistweaver at the moment is slightly above. The 3 specs at the bottom are more expected, so to speak. They are more underperforming compared to the other 4. Even looking at this other sets of results from Warcraft logs, you still have Mistweaver, Resto, Discipline, and Preservation with a clear gap compared to the other 3. Now, we also have to make the mention about the tier sets, of course. Not all of the healers get in the tier set, which might be even more relevant than the DPS, because to everyone who has raided at least in the last few expansions and in the last few tiers in a raiding guild might have noticed that the gear tends to be funneled to DPS players first, especially when it comes the tier set. So it is more likely that multiple healers right now are healing without a completed 4-piece of the new tier. And this is quite relevant, of course, because the tier sets are quite powerful for quite a few of these specs, but not all of them. For example, the 4-piece of Preservation Evoker is quite weak, while the 4-piece of Holy Priest is very, very strong. It might depend on just the average amount of healers who were able to put their hands on a 4-piece set bonus of the new tier, this level of healing. In terms of the popularity of the picks, we can see that in general, Discipline is by far the most popular, followed by Holy as well as Mistweaver. The other 4 specs are all sort of fighting each other in the much lower down position of popularity when it comes to Mythic progression. It is also interesting to point out that despite the vast popularity of Discipline, as usual, we still see Holy Priest being quite well represented, as it seems to be there are many players who just refuse to play Discipline, especially of the Holy kind. They generally just want to stick to Holy regardless of their performance, which at least at the start of this tier doesn't seem nearly as competitive as their other option in the class. Now, it is also worth mentioning that these are, of course, for the first very few bosses. This is the healing for Nullroot, and then you have the healing for Igira, which starts being, a bit more challenging, but still nothing major. Then you have the one for Volcaros, which is vastly different in terms of performance. As you can see, all of a sudden Discipline drops much lower down and Resto Druid is suddenly spiking higher up. Volcaros is a unique type of fight. And then as soon as you enter Council, the amount of logs start being very, very few. So any type of judgment right now with barely an average of 50 logs per spec is very early, right? It is very early. So it's still bound to have some significant changes down the line. This was for healers, but it's the same for the DPS specs and their results in Mythic. This is just to see the results in the first week and how the specs have been doing, and in general their rankings in terms of the results of the first week. What we can finish with is, of course, with a word on how tanks have been doing, even though checking the results of tanks in the raid is much, much less relevant because it's tanks. Tanks in the raid are not particularly brought for being the strongest. We were checking here our raid situation from Raider.io. We can go and check Mythic Plus, right? You look at the tanks, and apparently the strongest tank is easily Vengeance, right? Obviously. But then you move into the raid and Vengeance is not nearly as popular. Why? Because Havoc is meta. Havoc is meta, which means you don't need a tank to bring you the Demon Hunter debuff. What you need, for example, is Paladin to give you a second aura in case you don't run Retribution. If you do run Retribution and you have double aura from the Holy Paladin, then what you might need is Brewmaster, because Windwalker is super weak, and if you don't have a Mistweaver in your healing comp, then you need Brewmaster Monk, for example. That is generally what tanks are used for in the raid, to fill the gaps of the debuffs in the raid. So even though the meta tank right now is Vengeance, the fact that Havoc is also Giga meta right now means there is not much of a reason to see Vengeance. And the only reason why Vengeance is still that popular, regardless of not really bringing anything extra to the raid, is because it's very strong in Mythic Plus. So there are plenty of Mythic Plus mains still raiding and ending up raiding on a Vengeance. But that's more or less the only reason why we will be checking on the tanks, just to see their popularity, because you can't really check much on anything else on a first glance, at the very least, in terms of the results. Yeah, sure, we can check on their DPS, their boss damage, single target DPS, it's still quite even and average, with the usual problem of Protection Paladin and single target damage. But besides that, it's not even that much of a difference. So these are the results so far when it comes to tanking, when it comes to healing in the raid, as well as when it comes to DPSing in the raid in the first week, in the first reset. So we are talking about roughly an average of 3 to 4 bosses in terms of results. So we still have to look at way more logs of the first bosses, but also then way more logs of all of the bosses later down the line of this raid tier. For today, on this Tuesday, it's time to leave each other. We are saying our goodbyes first by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, of course, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, it's time to leave each other once more. Thank you guys, of course, for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime... why my eyes have been burning the past, like, 3 minutes before ending this video? What is this?